We're now ready to begin the painting itself. So I have some of my colours mixed up here. I'm going to mix them up again as I go. We're not going to necessarily stick exactly with the colours we've mixed up. We may need to develop them a little bit throughout the process. So I have my paints, I have my panel tinted with a small bit of acrylic, burnt umber. I have my medium and I have brushes. I have some filbert hog brushes. I also have a synthetic flat. It's going to be good for doing the ferry because it can create some really beautiful hard edges. What it doesn't give is much expression or character to your paint. So a combination of the two. I'm going to use this flat for the very sharp graphic shape of the ferry, and then I'm going to use the hog for the much more fluid expressive marks of the rest of the painting. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take possibly some of my black paint that I mixed up, which was ultramarine, alizarin and a small bit of yellow, and I'm just going to do a very, very gentle light drawing out. I know that my boat is going to come in here. I'll just come back to that in a minute. I also want to set in the rocks. Just a little guideline for now. Okay, I'll come back to that. I'm going to go now and get the image of that ferry. You'll find the photo in the file. You can also go off the drawing that we made. I'm going to use the same paint with this synthetic brush, and you'll see if you use the side of it, or the edge of it I mean, you get some really sharp edges. Now one thing to notice is the boat doesn't sit on the horizon, it sits down a little bit, and this means we can perceive it as being closer to us. It's amazing the difference that 3mm makes. It doesn't look like much, but in terms of painting it probably represents about 1 kilometre of distance. Right, so ferry, let's get the bridge on top. This is about the 4th time we've drawn this out now, so we should have a good idea of the shape. Ramp at the back. Actually, this is the bridge, isn't it? I think that's called the superstructure. Okay, there's our ferry. Take a step back, look at the shape. I think maybe I've made that a little bit too big. And this bottom part needs to be a little more defined. Okay, now I'm going to come in with my paints and paint it in. Are there any really, really dark areas? Yes, there's the funnel. Okay, it is quite dark. We then have the bridge at the back, or the ramp at the back. Okay, now on for the blue of the boat. Now, one thing we have to remember in a landscape setting is that there's ambient light all over the place. Everything's bouncing off each other. So most colours that we mix will be toned down somewhat. Whereas that boat literally is probably ultramarine in colour. When it gets into the distance, it's picking up all the ambient light of the sky, so it's going to change a little bit. So I'm going to take some ultramarine, I'm going to pop in a little bit of my lilac colour just to tone it down somewhat. Okay, I might tone it down a little bit more, and that'll create a much more natural colour rather than the ultramarine straight out of the tube. As things recede, saturation disappears from them. Okay, you can see you can get some really sharp edges with these paints. Now remember, this side was slightly lighter, so what I'm going to do is put in a little bit of white into it and warm it up slightly with a little bit of the yellow. Still want to keep it fairly dark. The great thing about these brushes is you can just push a really sharp edge across. If your whole painting is done in this, it can end up looking very graphic, very hard edged, not much expression in it or character. Okay, so use these quite sparingly, these brushes I tend to. Right, in now for the shadow part of the main bit of the ferry, the top part of the ferry. Everywhere we have shadow, I'm going to paint it in. You can do it in as few brush marks as possible. It's going to look much more natural. And then shift and get the warm white. You can see the effect now of cool and warm. Suddenly there's light on it. It looks three-dimensional, it looks alive. Again, don't overpaint the thing. Okay. Now, this works because the background is relatively simple around this. We don't have a lot of intricate paintwork going on in the back. It's all going to be sort of a light bluish lilac. One last thing is those darker accents. Okay, and the ferry is pretty much done. Look carefully, do we see any other little accents? There are some accents of red. So let's get our red. Again, tone it down a little bit, possibly with the lilac. Okay, we've got a small bit of red at the back. These tiny accents can make quite a difference. And a few little accents on the ship. Right, let's zoom out. Now we have our colours for the sky. We don't have anything mixed for the clouds. Now it is actually a combination pretty much of the two whites that we mixed up here. So the lilac and the warm white. Let's have a look. Yeah, that looks okay. So you might want to mix up a little more of that paint. So we've got white, a little bit of blue, a little bit of red, and we're pretty much doing 3 colour mixing here. We've got blues, yellows and reds. So everything is going to be a combination of these, and a little bit of yellow. We have to be careful that it doesn't push too far. Just a tiny bit of paint will pull that more towards the sort of pink, and a tiny bit of blue will push it down towards the purple. It's incredible the difference the eye will pick up. Okay, so I'm going to come in now and look at that lovely shape that I had, which was, when I perceived it out there, it was kind of making a sort of an angle, not too severe. So what I had was a large mass down in the clouds, the bottom of the scene. Because I'm on a sort of mid-tone background, I don't have to go right up to these edges. It's very close in value. What I'm painting is very close in value to the cloud tone. Okay, and it sort of comes up in these horizontal sort of strata. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like that for now. I may come back and revisit that. But what that means, I can get the beautiful blue gradient of the sky in. So plenty of paint for this. Ultramarine, a little bit of white. I'm just going to bring in a little bit of the cobalt as well. Yeah, we've got a beautiful deep blue. So it's going to come down in bands. I'm using the side of the brush. Don't overpaint it, overwork it. But the paint needs to be fairly thick and laid on with confidence. I think what a lot of people tend to do is use too little paint and then overwork it, rather than more paint and work it less. So just laying those bands in, not worrying too much about where they meet for now. Let's come down again for a lighter one, a little bit more yellow in it, so we're tinting towards the green. Okay, and then we'll see these little islands of light peeking through the clouds. I can then come back up and work on the edges where they meet, both the clouds and where these blocks of colour meet each other. This one should make quite a difference when I join that. So when I join it, I'm just joining the point where they meet. I'm not dragging dark paint right down into light paint. Okay. So when we've got good theory and planning, we don't necessarily need to copy exactly what we see. I'm just going to lift that blue up a little bit more. Okay. Now I might just block in the other two sections. I'm going to block in the darks. So we tend to keep the darks fairly thin. So I make up my purple, add a bit of yellow. Let's see. Yeah. So it's a dark colour. Depending on what proportions you have, it can be, just like we did with the clouds, it could tend towards the blue, towards the red, towards the yellow. So try and balance the whole thing so that you get a neutral brown. Now I'm going to take a little more care on the rocks, getting that shape right. I'm going to block the whole thing in because it's such a strong paint. I don't want to put it on thickly. I want to keep the darks thin so that I can work into them. Okay, keep it nice and thin. Okay, and last thing to block in is the sea. So we had two greens. We had a very dark green, which was ultramarine, bit of Indian yellow, just a tiny touch of white if we need it. There we go, nice dark, cool green. We get the stripes going across. In my photo there's quite a lot of them, but if we remember back to the sketch I did, I think I only picked out 2 or 3, and then there's a larger block of shadow coming across the foreground. Okay. You might get, obviously as these bands recede, they're going to get thinner. So that one in the background might be a little bit too wide. We want some very subtle thin lines just right out there towards the horizon. Okay, and then we shift and get the warmer green, which had more yellow in it. For me it had more cobalt turquoise in it. Some white. I have a milky green. Okay, and there's a very basic block in done. So good spot, good time to just take a break, clear the head, have a cup of tea, and allow that paint just to set a small bit, just to dry off a little.